grateful about that. It's wonderful to watch the visitors being so inspired by our actual solo show of Sarah Oppenheimer and Kristen Streuli. And I'm delighted to welcome my two guests, both sitting in their office in New York. SOYOUNG YOON. She's an assistant professor and program director of art history and visual studies at the Department of the Arts in Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts at the New School in New York. And she's also a visiting faculty of critical theory of the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. And she's also the author of a substantial essay of our upcoming publication about Sarah's work N01 in our museum. And then I welcome Sarah. Hi, Sarah. She's a renowned international artist. She lives and works in New York. Her recent projects include solo exhibition at the Drawing Center in New York, at the Kunsthaus Basel-Land. I also say hello to my colleague from Kunsthaus Basel-Land. She's also joining, Ines Goldbach. And other shows at the Mudam in Luxembourg, the Paris Art Museum in Miami, and the Wexner Center for the Arts, and the Mass MoCA. She has permanent installation work at the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Mattress Factory. And she's a senior critic on the Yale University School of Art. So after my short introduction, I will pass the mic to Sarah, who will introduce us to her exhibition in Thun. And then I will have the pleasure to talk with SOYOUNG and Sarah. And thereafter, you will have the possibility to interact with questions on chat. So let me briefly give you some information about our collaboration with Sarah and how it took place. So for some years ago, I was following Sarah's work, and I was very impressive also about her show she had in Switzerland, like I said, Kunsthaus Basel-Land in 2014, but of course also at the Gallery of von Bartha in Basel. And I had so many fascinating discussions with her at her studio, but also here in Switzerland. So I thought it would be very challenging to involve her to realize a work in our museum, former Grand Hotel from 1874. Architecture, and also a very old building, of course, with old floors. So it's very difficult to interact because it's also, yes, it's a conserved structure. And so I asked her to visit, and she came and she was looking at the place and if it would be possible to realize something for a work for our museum. And despite it was so challenging, she got very inspired of the building and developed a new work, which was the starting point of this groundbreaking art piece N01. So after long plannings and a lot of interaction between her studio in New York and our technician in Thun, this work came alive. And I was, during her installation now, during the work or the installation of the work in Thun, I was watching it every day and it came alive, and it was a fantastic experience to see how the atmosphere in the museum was changing, also for me and for our team. And I like to compare the work to like a Swiss clockwork, which really functions swiftly, soundly, and smoothly. And like a Swiss clock, it also has to be wounded by a human hand. And now, when it's open again, fortunately, people will touch it and interact with it. And it has to be, yes, it has to be really, it's so precise. So I'm really fascinated how this work came alive in your museum. So Sarah, I would like to give you the mic, and you could please tell us a little bit more about your thoughts. That would be great. Thank you.
Hello, SOYOUNG. I'm going to share this. I think this screen is being shared, but let me just see if it's being shared. Should be shared now. So just 1 second.
Yes.
Just 1 moment. Okay, now it should be sharing.
Yes, it's sharing.
Okay, great. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very, very much, Helen, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for taking the time today to join us. I'm going to talk briefly about the work to both contextualize the work within my own practice and thinking, as well as hopefully contextualize it within the space of Kunstmuseum Thun. So to say a bit about that, I will start out by saying the last several years I have been very preoccupied by the notion of a building as a sensitive organism. So for example, revolving a door, opening a window, or closing a set of blinds sets in motion a relay of material and immaterial exchange. Periodic changes in our environment correspond with frequencies of human habitation. Day becomes night, people enter a room, and doors swing open and closed. These temporal cycles intersect and overlap, oscillating between phase offset and synchrony. NO1, the piece developed for Kunstmuseum Thun, explores these periodic and collaborative dynamics. So, how to consider such a complex choreography of change? In order to do this, in the case of NO1, I wanted to isolate the two variables, one being a human changing periodic input, and the other being an environmental changing periodic output. And that is shown here, where we have an input in solid white and an output as a hatched rectangle. And this began several years ago through a duration of prototyping, where I started to look at the dynamics of an input, which was a human motored rotary motion, shown here with this kind of mechanism turning, and a linear driven output, a sliding mechanism that is moving up and down. And as you can see, there is a frequency relationship between the number of rotations required to drive this mechanism back and forth a single time. This phase relationship evolved through the development of a very specific mechanical system, which is known as a worm drive or a level winder screw. And here you can see that by turning this cylinder with an inscribed acceleration curve on its surface, you're driving a peg linearly back and forth. You can change the periodic relationship between rotation and slide a number of different ways, but the earliest prototypes used a very slowly rotating cylinder where you have, let's say, 20 turns of that cylinder required to drive the mechanism back and forth a single time. And you can change the relationship between the number of rotations input to the number of linear oscillations output both by changing the inscribed sine curve on the surface of the screw, but also by changing the gearing between the input and output. So here we have a relationship of 1 rotation equaling 1 linear oscillation. This phased relationship between input and output evolved over the past several years, and I was very interested in considering how this relationship might apply to something as simple or common, perhaps is a better term, something as common as a rotating door. And how specifically this idea of doors and the presence of rotating doors had such a sort of valence in the context of the Kunstmuseum, which was divided and subdivided into a series of very specific and habitable rooms. In the case of the Kunstmuseum, the network of inputs and outputs became relatively elaborate. Here you can see that there are 4 inputs, and these 4 inputs are actually activating 8 different outputs, some of which are stacked on top of inputs. So for example, this input is affecting an output immediately below it. It is also affecting an output immediately below this input and a further output. And so that the spatial organization of the inputs and outputs in some ways operates independently of the network relationships. But here you can see that the spatial organization does not operate independently of a kind of perceptual experience of this network. So the way that these inputs and outputs are distributed through the museum, in this case Kunstmuseum Thun, has a very specific relationship to the procession through the museal space. So as a person enters the museum, they primarily will enter from this axis. They will encounter an input and output relationship immediately upon entry. And that's what I'm going to speak briefly about before I open this up to a larger conversation. So I want to talk about specifically the input and output, or the phased periodic relationship between the moving viewer as they enter and walk through this space, and the input and output apparati. So as you enter the exhibition, you're walking down this corridor and you're seeing an input, which is here shown as a black and white hatched line that's driving back and forth, specifically an output that is immediately below it, this white wall. And here you can understand the same relationship in elevation, where this input, which is actually a large glass volume, is driving back and forth a wall mass below it, a white wall mass. And the periodic relationship between input and output is of great importance. It takes 3 full rotations of the input to slide the output back and forth a single time. And this is the view that you encounter when you enter the exhibition. So as I indicated earlier, the input here is driving the lower volume back and forth. The upper volume is not being driven by this input. In fact, the upper volume is driven by an input around the corner over here. So here we have another glass volume that is input by another museum visitor. And as this rotates, it slides back and forth a upper volume on above this kind of threshold space and the upper volume across this threshold space. And in this short video, you can see how that's operating. So this is the upper volume oscillating back and forth in elevation. And this is the input, and this is the other output oscillating back and forth. And they operate at the same periodicity. So 3 rotations of the vertical glass input results in a single oscillation of the linear slide outputs. Here you can see the second input, and this input is driving this upper output and also the output over here. And here you can see it in motion. And you'll notice the moving element above this output. Both inputs seen here from the opposite side are in fact operating as an off-center pivot. And so for every 1.5 rotations of the input, the output aligns directly atop the input mechanism. And I think this is very important in my thinking as I've sort of reconsidered this work again and again. As these alignments happen and these misalignments happen, you start to understand this volume, this large vertical volume, as singular, as a single kind of mass in space. It also starts to relate to other input and output situations distributed throughout these rooms, specifically to the light levels that are generated by windows that look out in the foreground of this particular frame, where visitors to adjacent galleries control light levels that then drive the reflective values across the glass surfaces. And these louvers in the adjacent room are driven, the louvers here are driven by inputs over here. And in fact, that video, the last video we were watching, was shot from out here, and the louver that it was affecting, that was being viewed, was here. And that was being driven by a visitor to the museum quite remote from that initial camera location. These are the input mechanisms, these long extrusions, these black extrusions. And this is the input mechanism that drove the louver that was viewed in the last image. And this is an overview of the arrangement of inputs and outputs throughout the Kunstmuseum Thun. So with that in mind, I will pass this back to Helen.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so fascinating to see all the work behind. I mean, it's so well thought, and when you're in the museum, you don't see, of course, all this mechanical behind, but you can have a feeling how everything is working precisely. So I would like to start some questions to you and SOYOUNG, and start with SOYOUNG.
Sorry, Sarah, could you stop the screen sharing? Yes, so that we could, perfect, great.
So SOYOUNG, you know Sarah's work for many years now, and you have also had many exchange in visiting her in the studio, also preparing, of course, the essay for publication. How do you contextualize this new work of Sarah? And do you think it's a logical consequence after her work in the Mass MoCA, for instance, or at von Bartha and Scamp?
Thank you very much, Helen, and just again for this opportunity to continue the conversation. So short answer is yes, in the sense that it, I think, both intensifies and complicates like an earlier logic of the work. But I wanted to go back a little further to begin actually with the series of studio visits I had with Sarah, because in many ways it seems to articulate so much of the particular kind of challenge and invitation like that Sarah's work asked of the viewer or the audience. So I remember when I first heard, not only saw Sarah's work, but then attended an artist talk about Sarah's work, I was really struck by an initial sense of disjunction between the seeming simplicity of what I was initially thinking I was perceiving, and then hearing the particular kind of precision and detail in which how you realize something as simple as opening a door, or opening and closing a door, opening or closing a window becomes like shaped and remolded and connected into these series of exchanges. So I was really struck by that initial disjunction that becomes both a provocation and an invitation for the viewer, like to continue, in a sense, not so much see, but to learn over time. And that was something that was repeated in our studio visits, because unlike other studios I've done with other artists, this happened over a series of 2 years where I would keep on going back to the studio, and not so much to see a work coming into being, but it was an odd way, a series of exchanges ourselves, where there was a sense of semi-autonomy, like in my questions, in my comments, and that would constantly create again a kind of series of relays. So duration, like time, like was very important for me to actually begin to move beyond the initial perception of the work to learn the work. So one of the things I'm highlighting here is not only the sense of time, but the particular kind of participation on the part of the viewer and the audience, and the process of learning, so that Sarah's work becomes a kind of pedagogy that I particularly admire and want to follow. Like, and secondly, and this perhaps leads to another point, was that when I looked at Sarah's work, I was immediately struck by that I finally understood a comment that I had read a long time ago in the writings of Theodor Adorno, where in Minima Moralia, he made this comment that one of the ways we can understand our societal ills is that people have forgotten how to close doors, like that they slam them shut or don't close them tightly when they go through. And this is articulated further by the logic of these mechanicized doors, like sliding doors or rotating doors. And I never quite understood that until I saw Sarah's work. And I realized what it means to pay such attention to something as simple as something seemingly as simple as how do we enter in and leave a space. So what does it mean to mark those thresholds with a machine as seemingly as simple as a door? And what does it mean to take that very, very seriously? So if that was my initial beginning, I think particularly what was striking about NO1 is that in contrast, or rather than contrast, in elaboration than some of the earlier work, what becomes very foregrounded is that sense of a series of linkages. Like, so the network that Sarah describes is in a sense more complex. And if there's a shift of emphasis, it's always there in the present work, But if in the previous work, if there was an insertion of a discrete apparatus, and then the changing of quote unquote the shell, or rather the structure of the building environment, that's very subtle. Like, so it seems more discrete. Like here, but also always within it, there is that series of relays and transmissions and communications that the works both provoke and invite. Now, in the work at Kunstmuseum Thun, that sense of linkages and relays are much more foregrounded with that very complex network of input and output that Sarah just described.
Thank you. I would like to come back afterwards to your fascinating theory in relation to Dora's cultural technique. But Sarah, maybe I would like to ask you, I mean, the museum as such, it's such a complex, complex architecture with the old ceilings, old floors. And how did you develop this term of, like SOYOUNG said, network in your museum? What was the initial idea about that?
So, Helen, I was so excited when I first was invited to visit the museum, because the museum offered a really extraordinary, in my mind, an extraordinary situation and an extraordinary opportunity. And that has everything to do with, I believe, not solely the museum, but the museum as it is contextualized in the world of contemporary art architecture. And it seemed, in fact, it remains to me something of an anomaly, because you have this extraordinary temporal overlay of another programmatic intent for the building that is operating at the level of the kind of discrete and specific rooms. So each room had a very identified program, and the rooms were different, intentionally architecturally differentiated from one another, and it created this potential for accentuating a situation of linkage, meaning that rather than, perhaps better said, in contrast to contemporary art institutions where there's a kind of uniformity, they all sort of appear to be sequences of white cubes where lighting situations, air situations are very similar from space to space. In the case of the Kunstmuseum, you have these small, very contained situations where each room is very, very distinct. And I became very excited by that distinctness and by exploring the complexity of how these, let's call them chambers, were linked to each other, both visually, processionally, and I would say aesthetically in certain ways. And so that was a sort of beginning of seed. And the other thing, and I believe this speaks to something SOYOUNG you were referring to, is that in a situation like this, there is a kind of accentuation that occurs on the threshold. There's an emphasis that starts to, and a pressure that starts to mount around how the transition from one location to another location is articulated architecturally and perceived habitually. And that created a really exciting sort of canvas on which and within which to work.
So SOYOUNG, you also foreground that misalignment between the Grand Hotel and Modern Art Museum in your essay. Like Sarah told now about this history, these rooms who are a little bit like haunted, or moreover the history of a place lives again and again. Like you said, you were mentioning the literary critic Frederick Jamieson. Could you explain a little bit more about this fascinating theory you had in mind when you wrote the essay?
Absolutely. I mean, following on what Sarah just described, I was quite struck the very the prehistory of the Kunstmuseum Thun as this grand hotel. And I think especially for the so-called New World ears, the Grand Hotel is such a particular historical marker of a turn of a century and the height of the leisure classes, like the turn of the 20th century. And so, in a sense, because of that marker, it becomes a stand-in for history itself, and becomes the setting for so many historical narratives about what it means to inhabit history with a capital H. So I was particularly struck by not only the way that it seems distinct, as Sarah pointed out, from the interventions like that Sarah was making in contrast to, in previous work, there's that kind of white cube modernist museum, to now this grand hotel. And what seemed quite striking for me was that in the previous work, if Sarah's works to compel us to intensify the differences that can be overlooked in the seeming uniformity of these modernist spaces, now there was a new kind of challenge in how do you recalibrate a different series of differences from the hierarchy of distinctions that the Grand Hotel also comes already fully marked. And so to answer your question, Helen, I was thinking about that sense of seeming like misalignment, realignment, like that Sarah's work compels us to think about, like between this Grand Hotel that stands in for history with a capital H, and this is particularly Frederick Jameson's thesis, where that it's the Grand Hotel which becomes a kind of maze with multiple rooms where guests come in like in cyclical ways, becomes a trope for a historical haunting of its own, so that the Grand Hotel is, especially for the contemporary imagination, always a haunted space, and haunted by history, the ghosts of history. And his particular example was, of course, from Stanley Kubrick's film The Shining, which has the famous Overlook Hotel that in I think contemporary imagination becomes a certain prototype for the Grand Hotel itself. But I think one of the key distinctions I want to make here is that to go through Sarah's work, or to, in a sense, learn with it, is not to experience a different kind of haunting of history. You know, we're not going through the installation to think anew of these ghosts of the Grand Hotel, but how do we inhabit both the past, like, of the hotel, its previous markers, its previous distinction, and through a series of subtle realignments, not so much become haunted by history, but inhabit it differently, where it's not ghosts, but rather different resonances of our own selves, just parceled out through time. Like, so yes, we live in history, but we are not haunted by its past or dominated by the looming sense of its future. Like, and so I can keep on going, but I think especially now, like, where and I wrote most of the essay. I wrote the essay from afar, right? and to really think of not just a museum, but this as a Grand Hotel, as something history with a capital H, as the past, and how, in a sense, the Sarah's work bring it closer, like, but not something that I can immediately then grasp and possess, but compel us to constantly go back, like, and think about what does it mean to live historically, to be present.
Absolutely. But Sarah, I think with your work now, with this work, you also reinvent a little bit a new history, you know, in your building.
So Helen, I just want to respond to something about this notion of occupying a space that has many historical registers is not solely to occupy it in a long historical register, but in fact It could even be, we could imagine, if we're thinking of this as temporal phasing, that you are occupying it in relation to others. And others could be existing within the same contemporary time, and they could also be existing within a historical time or within a future time. And that if we think of the sort of habitation of living bodies within living buildings, we can imagine that all of these things are in flux. The building is in flux, the inhabitants are in flux, and that we are in flux both in a historical time, understanding past, but also in a kind of simultaneous moment. And I think that it becomes very interesting then for me to think of how the creation and the shaping of the space that we inhabit, such as the Grand Hotel specifically, can be the result of many bodies and many individuals and many consciousnesses and many times overlapping. And I think that the work is trying in many ways to expand the possibility of how we experience sharing a space and sharing a time, and how that shared habitation, meaning, for example, you walk into a room and you move something, but you are also somehow affected by other parts of the space moving. That has to do not just with your relation to the space, but your relation to others in other locations in the same building. And this is true not only in a simultaneous moment, but also in a historical sort of timeline. And I think that in some ways the piece strives to erode the differentiation between the now and then, or the here and the there, and to make those relationships constitutive of each other.
And if I could just add to that, absolutely. I mean, I think in one of our discussions is to think of it not as be it a narrative, like, or a uniform structure, like the way that time itself is molded, but rather shifting layers of superimposed time, where there is not a hierarchy or a norm according to which there is only one past, present, and future. And I just wanted to bring back, Helen, so that previously you were mentioning a comparison to the Swiss clock. And in my own discussion, I was thinking about also a different kind of time measuring device to compare Sarah's work with, and that was the metronome. And this was partly in discussion with Sarah, where she raised that this discussion that if the metronome had, in a sense, been invented in the history of science and music as a way to discipline and to regulate and discipline bodies, like the rhythms of performances, but then in relationship to that, the metronome also produces new modes of expressivity, that new registers of timekeeping that is now possible precisely because of the metronome. So the metronome does not only become a regulatory device, right, and that it could be used differently to allow for different ways of inhabiting time. And this is in some relationship to how I think about Sarah's work.
Absolutely. So I would like to come back to this, to your essay, SOYOUNG, also in relation to this technical, or the door as a cultural technique, because I think it's also very important to think about it now in your situation, you in New York, we here in Europe. Can you maybe relate it a little bit more to Sarah's work, because I think it's such an interesting theory you had there in your mind.
So without spending too much time, the term cultural technique comes from German media theory. And one of the things it wants to emphasize is the very technologies and conditions of knowledge itself. So it's a way of, in a sense, decentering the arts and the humanities from the human actor, the human subject, to think about in a profoundly relational way, how our own behaviors, our own gestures also change who we are, like our social relations, like so that the human actor, or to use Sarah's term, a kind of the variable human input, becomes a part of a living organism. Like, so we become decentered as agents, like, and we both act and are acted upon. So that's a very simple way of trying to talk about cultural techniques and to think about what was helpful for me as a certain method of understanding Sarah's work, and that what kind of relationship she's setting up with time and space and our own engagement. And I couldn't help considering our contemporary moment that the discussion of thresholds, like of who is inside, who is outside. What does it mean to be inside and outside, especially in a moment where right now in the United States, where especially in New York, which is one of the epicenters of the novel coronavirus, that the question of boundaries, like of borders have just had a kind of renewed urgency. It's not new, but it's a renewed urgency. And this question of thresholds has, especially right now, we were talking before the panel discussion, but the United States is a flame, like where the long histories of systemic structural injustice that is very much a part of the system has also, again, come to the fore. So this is not to, in a sense, over-determine the work, but how the work also incorporates like these questions, like and compels us to again beyond our current present, like but what would it mean to think for me to both account for history but not be determined by its ghosts, like, and what does it mean to take thresholds very seriously, but also not re-inscribe a threshold to just create new insides and new outsides. I mean, I think one of the strengths of Sarah's work is that it's not a work of exposure, like to say, this is the truth, this is what's hidden inside, to reveal the so-called hidden truth, but it doesn't work in that way, that it's not a dynamic of revelation, but rather a long process of learning where you have to become a part of, and then in the reshaping of what it means to learn anew. Like, Sarah, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that something you're saying really strikes me, and I've been very aware of the timing actually of this exhibition in relation to events across the world, and also obviously more locally, and that has to do with the possibility of, and the possibilities and the complexity of collaboratively shaping space and collaboratively shaping a kind of shared public sphere. And what does it mean as we navigate this? How do we learn to collaborate? How do we learn to measure the effect of our own gesture, the effect of our own presence? And how do we, in measuring and sort of assessing that, then edit or rethink our own relationship to the whole? And what also, I think this is very important to me, what then constitutes the whole? And I don't just mean the whole of, let's say, the single human being, but I mean the whole of the larger social body and the whole of the built environment and the whole of even something as specific as the artwork. Where is that boundary, and how do we play into and make porous that edge?
So I would like also to ask Sarah maybe a last question, because I think we are moving forward here with the time, and I would like to also let the audience ask some questions. So Sarah, for you, the interaction with the visitors is so very important. I mean, it's one of the main thing in your work, that we have to experience the work, we have to make your own experience, and it's through the interaction that we really can, yes, really live your piece. So how do you, when you develop a work, how do you think, or do you think about the visitor, or do you let the visitor at a second, I mean, just to react afterwards when the work is standing, or do you think with the visitor in your mind when you do the work, or to develop the work?
So I'd like to return to a theme that SOYOUNG raised earlier, which is this idea about learning. And I believe that in many ways, the process of development of the work of this piece in particular is a learning process. And it's a process that is one that has many, many extensions and many material and embodied iterations. And specifically, I'm thinking about how a work like this evolves, both in terms of a remote location, meaning thinking about the context of walking through this building as an imagined visitor, as an imagined other person, and what is encountered and when is it encountered and how is it encountered, but also how that can be anticipated in the development of a piece here where, let's say, I am actually working at a given moment. So one of the things that becomes very important is to understand as sort of haptically as possible the amount of tactile sort of feedback that one has with these architectural instruments. So as I showed in some of the early images, there's a really intense process of prototyping whereby that feel of something, how much resistance, how much inertia, how much momentum, what does it mean to perceive a rotational speed in relation to a linear speed? How does that test the kind of parameters of perception? How do I measure scale? So everything is actually developed at a one-to-one scale and mocked up at a one-to-one scale. But of course, all of that said, it's impossible to anticipate the experience of the piece at the Kunstmuseum here in New York. And in that way, I find the opportunity very singular and sort of significant, because there is an arc of this learning process, and that arc includes the development of all of the sort of internal mechanisms. It includes the planning, it includes the realization of the work, but it also very much includes the sort of post-occupancy feedback, which is what happens when people are actually interacting. How am I learning from that? Something really extraordinary for me was being able to be in the Kunstmuseum shortly after the exhibition opened and watching people moving the piece in a quiet environment and then sort of doubling back as they started to register their effect and register the effect of others at the same time. And it was really fascinating to watch that slow process of habituation and defamiliarization that occurred as people sort of moved back and forth across the exhibition. And I will say lastly that that learning process doesn't end it doesn't end. So in some ways, for me, it's a continual cycle, and this discussion and the questions and comments that people contribute only further that learning process.
I would also say that the work is about sharing, because when we are in the space, we are sharing and experience with the visitors. People are getting curious. Because people are not used to touch the work, you know. So it's through the interaction that something happened then between us or between visitors who has never met before, which is very striking for me. So I would like to thank you, SOYOUNG, and thank you, Sarah, for this interesting and very, yes, I think also hopefully for audience, very exciting exchange. And also I would ask people now if they're there, if there's somebody who wants to ask questions. We are here, all three of us. Just check. Is there questions from the audience? look like?
I think Robin has a question. Robin, if you could unmute yourself.
Oh, please.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, thanks. This is so exciting. I'm just very, very happy to learn more and more about this project, and I wish so much that I could get there before it closes, which seems unlikely. But I have a couple of questions. First of all, to Helen, can you talk about any changes or no changes about the way that you are engaging with the public in regards to the interactivity of this piece from when it first opened to sort of after your reopening?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, Robin. Well, you know, I really like to observe how the people are reacting to the piece, because it's like, it's not usual, as you know, that people can interact with works, and especially because the work is quite, I mean, also very big in the space, so people are really carefully. I don't know how it is in the States, but people are really shy at the beginning, and when I see the people not really trying or they are afraid of touching it, we are speaking with them, and some of them really get into it and then realize how wonderful it can be to interact, to mirror himself in the piece. So it's like something is starting, and people around coming and looking and watching it. So there's a wonderful energy then in the space when people are touching it. Or yeah, it's really fantastic to watch.
I mean, I understand that there is a kind of reluctance or opening of new possibility that people can touch things in an art museum context. But I'm wondering, is there any difference after the pandemic in terms of ideas about sharing space and touching things? Or is your situation sort of, I don't know, safe enough that that's not really playing into the dynamic of the exhibition?
Well, we opened the museum 2 weeks ago, so people are coming slowly back. But the people who are in the museum, they really, well, they're really thirsty to see art. They can have gloves if they want, or what we are also doing is that we are accompanying the visitors, and my staff is disinfection the glass, so it works very well. So people are not really hesitating. We give them really advice how to touch it now in this situation.
Thanks.
Did you answer?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Greta has a hand up. Yes, if you could unmute. Oh, here.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi, thank you all so much. This was really fascinating, and it opened up a lot of thinking. I work on communication networks, and this is a really different and yet very similar kind of structure. I guess I kept thinking about, well, the work reminded me a little bit of infrastructure in old buildings like dumbwaiters, or like secret bookshelves. And, you know, there's this kind of Gothic sense of like uncanniness or hauntedness that you all were speaking to a little bit. And I guess the thing that kept coming up for me was sort of a question about power and where power lies in this experience, and also thinking about this as a exploration of, you know, historical spaces that have kind of a valence of power and domestic relationship sort of built into them. And I just find it really interesting because I think what we're seeing a lot in sort of networked information spaces is that when people feel like they don't have power, they start sort of spinning narratives, and that's where we start to get, you know, conspiracy theories and misinformation. So I think there's something really interesting happening here. That on the one hand, it really levels out the experience of power of something like a dumbwaiter that would be like a house mechanism that would enforce like an invisibility of, you know, how power works. So here everything's sort of out in the open, but you know, it does in that kind of way that people are learning as they experience the work. I think there's like maybe that's a slow, you know, way of gaining some power in the experience. But yeah, I just was really interested to think about how power works overall throughout every piece, every part of the piece. I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Sarah? Sarah, you're muted. Oh, can't hear you. Can I?
Muted, huh?
Yes, she's not muted, but Oh, should we try?
Okay, great.
Yes.
So I want to say that is so fascinating. And it's really fascinating to me because how power works in this context is something that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of this relationship between an input and an output, and also in relation to what we might want to call the transparency of the mechanism. So I want to talk about those things a little bit separately, and probably just the input and output relation for now, because I'm interested in other questions. But in particular, I was very troubled by this idea that there was just a kind of obvious and unidirectional correlation between the input and the output, meaning you turn something and it moves something else. And that is not sort of a reciprocal condition where the output can then affect the input. But the thing that struck me actually, and this goes back to Helen's question about learning, is that in actually inhabiting the space and watching how the piece worked, this notion of wholeness, what constituted, let's say, the body of the output, was not limited to the mechanical element that was moved. So for example, if you think of the part of the work where you have these 3 stacked boxes with the glass box in the middle, you have different controls driving different aspects of that, let's call it wall, and that, or that door. And as those controls work, there's a kind of shared or collaborative relationship between different operators. And I suddenly realized that the notion of the whole or the totality was in fact a kind of perceptual or perceived condition as much as it is a, let's call it scripted or mechanical condition. And that shifted the idea of power. Who controls what and how is it controlled, and is it simply about this kind of networked relations, or is it about a more inhabited spatial arrangement? It shifted that notion to a slightly different terrain. And I think your question is, or your comment is really fascinating and a really interesting one.
Thank you. We have time for another question, a last question.
Any other?
No?
Yes. So I don't know his name. Raymond?
Yes, exactly. But I'm unmuted.
Okay.
You are now unmuted. Yes.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Okay. Hi. Congratulations, Sarah. Congratulations, everybody there. It's a great looking project. So I have a very simple question. is there any sound? Is it silent? And Sarah, is it important for you, if it's silent, that it's silent, or is there sound, and is the sound of meaning to the work?
Yeah. Let's see.
So I think, Raymond, that's a very, very interesting question, and has come up in many ways in relation to this work. The first, to give you the simple answer, it is what we might want to call imperceptibly quiet, but I think that's not quite true. I think it operates at some kind of very low level of the threshold of sound perception. So you can hear it, and of course, if you put your ear on the volume of wall or on the input or the output, let's say, it resonates through that object. There's a vibration. And I've thought a lot about sound as the work has emerged, partially because I've been thinking extensively about frequency, and partially because I've been thinking about the relationship of sound to a kind of perceived change in architecture. And I think that if the sound had become more pronounced, the perception of the changed field would be diminished, because you would be very, very attentive to the sound of the work. At the same time, I think it's very important that it's not discussed as something that is silent, because in fact, the work is creating an oscillating vibration, and sound is a form of mechanical energy, and that energy is passing from the human body through the input to the output, and then it is reflected back to the human body. And that dynamic is a really important exchange, and it is a very haptic exchange, and I think sound operates that way. And I'll say one last thing, which has really played on my mind, and it has to do with the mechanical structure, which is the screw. That the screw itself has embedded in it, as you've seen, a sine wave, which obviously correlates with the way we visualize and consider the periodic change of sound. And I really like imagining that that acceleration curve is actually a score, a sonic score for the total work. And I consider in some ways the friction that occurs as the pawl drives up and down that channel, the sort of playing of that score.
So I think that we would like to end this interesting, fascinating talk, and I would like to thank you very much, Sarah and SOYOUNG, for your great intervention. Also the audience for the great questions and their concentration. And we will have a catalog coming soon at the beginning of July, and hopefully you will all have the possibility to see it. And also our exhibition in Toon will be until July 12th. So we still have a good moment to experience your work, Sarah, and thank you so much, everybody, to join, and we wish you a good afternoon in New York, and take care. Thank you so much. Bye.